Brodor, and this is Why We Game. My guest this episode is Morgan Weeks. Morgan is a designer, a developer, a writer, and if you have the right esoteric incantations and hand gestures, he may well be an editor. Morgan, how are you today?
I'm still alive.
You are still alive. That is not the most positive or glowing assessment of how you're doing.
But it is factual in respect to social contract.
Oh my gosh. Now, see, this is why I wanted to talk to you. When you and I met originally at Gen Con of this year through Pete Petruccia of Imagining Games, and you started talking about the things that you did in the gaming space, I was immediately fascinated by your diction and your command of language.
Thank you.
You're not sure how to take that? No, I think it is wonderful for me. You know, some people respect and admire the athletic and the people that can do these great physical feats. For me, people that have a strong imagination or the ability to wield language in a way that others can't, those are the people that I gravitate to, that I want to talk to.
Well, that's pretty fantastic because those are the people I am most interested in respecting as well.
Right on. Let's just get right into it. I'm going to give a little bit of your background before we get into Morgan as a younger person and getting into gaming. Your first game that you had come on the scene as someone who participated in publication, was that Short Order Heroes in 2013?
That is a deep dive. Yes. I wrote the Fate Rules adaptation for that product.
I have to say, Morgan, you are not easily cyberstalked. For example, do you have a Facebook page?
Technically, yes. So I had one and I deleted it in 2017, 2018, because I realized how awful it was. And then I created one again, say a year or two ago, but it isn't under my name. It was only for gaming promotional things and keeping tabs with my good friend and colleague, Jim Pinto, who is amazing and people should talk more about and to keep tabs with him, but I never log on to it. The only other social media I have is Twitter, and that exists only to promote my Earthbound work.
Well, and your Twitter handle, which I noticed, which is at EarthDawnPanda, which is just all one word, obviously, because you have two, first of all, just your business card, the actual bamboo, the background. Your card is very, very sleek. And I loved the bamboo silhouette, for lack of a better term, on your card. But then every picture I find with you involved on the internet somehow, and there aren't many, it's all some permutation of an adorable panda bear. What is your obsession with pandas?
Well, first off, if you flip that card over, you'll see a panda on the other side.
I am looking at it, and not only is it a panda, it's like doing this adorable belly flop with its hind legs forward toward its, front legs, and its front legs forward toward its snout, and it's really cute.
Thank you for the compliments on the card. I designed those with the help of a graphic designer in Corvallis, Oregon, and I was delighted with they came out. From the colors, the finish, the black foil. It was originally going to be silver until I found out black was an option, charcoal colors. Pandas are kind of useless at life in general. They're doomed for extinction without human intervention. They eat bamboo, which they're poorly designed to actually consume and has virtually no nutritional value to them. That's all they eat. So I identify with that as someone who is ill-suited for this world in many ways, but is still a part of it, and through human intervention continues to exist in it and be successful. Also, I've been told sometimes I look like a panda with the pale gamer skin and dark hair and penchant for wearing black or dark color.
I can confirm that if you leaned into it just a little bit, you could definitely do the panda thing.
So just been something that people called me when I was younger as a nickname because I tended to be quieter, speak kind of slowly, things in general a little slower than most people with deliberation. So it's my spirit animal.
Well, allow me to say this, and again, forgive me if I sound too. I don't want to sound, forgive the pun, pandering, but you obviously have a lot of tenacity. And what I mean is if you just described yourself as someone who is akin to the panda, and the reasons that you cited for me are also reasons that indicate your tenacity. I mean, just your blog alone, keeping up with that, the amount of contribution and effort, the work that you've done in the gaming industry. You know, I'm not trying to be too forward, but I think you sell yourself short. I think that you have a lot that you bring to the table, and I think that the industry is lucky to have you.
I mean, thank you very much. That's possibly one of the nicest things that's been said about my efforts. So they're kind of in an extreme niche little corner of the internet. I don't have a large following, but that's perfectly fine.
Well, sure. And I think that you probably experience as well as I do the one person, right? The one reader, the one listener, the one follower makes a huge difference.
It's true.
But let me take a step back from all that. So you said that Short Order Heroes, that was your first professional product.
Correct.
Okay.
That was my friend Jesse Butler's first product on the market. And I offered to help him with that in any capacity I could. That was the thing we talked about. And I said, I'll write it up for you.
Did you do writing, development, design? What was the depth of your effort in that project?
The project itself is some decks of cards with numbers on them and adjectives. The idea being you can quickly create an interesting NPC or even get ideas for characters by dealing yourself some of these cards to get traits for them. And how important that character is the number of descriptions they have, stemming from Jesse's brother-in-law joke of, oh, they're a 3-adjective NPC, this person must be important.
That's a good bit.
That was the origins of that project, and I helped figure out some of the words for it, but it was largely there. I wasn't the only one to help with that. There was other people. The
reason I start there, and it's not true for everyone with whom I've spoken in the industry, but, you know, a lot of people, their first project is often a thing that they are passionate about. So are you passionate about Fate, or did you just fall into this and it was coincidentally the Fate system?
That's a complicated question. So I love Fate, and in the way you can only hate something you love, there's things about Fate I hate. And that relates to my first project that I've shown at Gen Con and talked about to people, but have not yet published because it got sidelined by my bigger project. Pretty much as my career time backing up is I'm conversant in Fate, and the numbering scheme on those cards, which goes from 1 to 6, lends itself well to being used with Fate. So you can use them as a stand-in for D6s. And because of that, you can also use them as a stand-in for Fate dice by using 2 of them and subtracting one from the other to generate a positive and negative number. So my involvement with that is more, I'm passionate about helping my friends accomplish their goals.
Which is another common theme in the industry, it sounds like.
Yeah. And that is a lot of what I will do is help my friends because they're passionate about something. And I want to do what I can to make sure they accomplish what they're trying to do, which is ultimately how we met, with me helping Pete out.
Right, because you are if I read the team bio correctly on the internet, you are the editor extraordinaire on the Chew project.
I don't know about the second part of that, but I am definitely the editor on that project.
Well, I'll tell you what, let's put a pin in the professional side of things and let's hop into the TARDIS and take a step back in time to Morgan discovering gaming. So what was your introduction to the hobby?
Oh, okay. I want to say it was in 1988, if you will. I believe that was before AD&D second edition was even, but I could be wrong on that. A friend of the family, his name was Torbjorn Vordloff Jensen.
I'm sorry, and he was a vampire?
No, he was the child of some hippies who were getting in touch with their Norwegian roots.
Well, God bless him.
Yeah. Caltech does strange things to people.
That may be the quote of the episode.
He is a character in and of himself in so many different ways. But Torb introduced me to D&D through his own particular hack, which was common at the time of BECMI and first edition kind of together when he came out to stay with us. Our parents were old friends from, I want to say, Chico, California, where they lived across the street from each other. And he was looking at attending the local community college for whatever bizarre reason. But he stayed with us on our farm a few times and we played D&D. That started it all back in second grade.
At risk of prying, did you grow up on a commune?
No, it was an actual farm. My parents were hippies. My dad grew out of being a hippie and became what would be a unicorn these days of a liberal Republican.
I am from the Midwest, so I know precisely the person you're talking about. Not the individual, but the attitude that you're speaking of.
And he has his PhD in agricultural education engineering. His life is much more interesting than mine in many, many ways. But we, because of that, did have a working farm and with many curious stories about that life and how it contrasts with many of my current people in my life who are urban dwellers. But I do have a few friends who also grew up in rural areas, can commiserate on how different those experiences are. Not many people grew up around people who had skunks and raccoons as pets. I had a skunk named Stinky.
Of course.
There was at least 3 raccoons as pets in the area, all named Bandit.
That's wild. So you're living on the farm and you've got hippie parents and hippie friends of hippie parents. Their kid moves in with you and introduces you to D&D, which is a hacked version, like you said, which was pretty popular to do at the time.
Yeah.
And this is in the late 80s.
Correct.
You're playing D&D for, I mean, how intensely, how regularly were you playing? Was it a once a weekend sort of thing, or were you playing all weekend long?
We would play D&D whenever Torb was in town. He lived with us when he was visiting, and he liked to visit frequently enough. He technically lived in Northern California in a barn, so that's a thing.
So did you deviate and find a different or your own group?
Well, the area I lived in, there weren't many kids in general. My school had 13 children of a similar age to me, drawn from a very large area. And by all accounts, that's a pretty populous rural school. So there weren't a lot of kids, and I didn't own any D&D books. And I didn't play D&D with my friends. It was just Torb, my sister, and I. And then we moved to Jordan, where there was no D&D at all. So that pretty much ended until the Gulf War started, and Americans weren't very popular in Jordan. We got evacuated.
Okay. I was not going to reveal my ignorance, but when you said Jordan, I assumed that you meant the country.
You are correct. Yes,
May I inquire as to why your family moved to Jordan?
because my dad was doing agricultural research and development with OIRD in Jordan for agricultural growing techniques, trying to help the Jordanians advance and produce more crops per acre. It was before technically Operation Desert Storm happened, but we got evacuated during the process. I'm going to say Desert Shield with the invasion of Kuwait, and Jordanians identified more with Iraq than Kuwait, who are Persians. So the Arab world was not happy with the U.S. There was a number of unpleasant circumstances in the last month or two of being in Jordan when all the Americans were effectively evacuated and then came back to Oregon, where all of this is taking place. But we didn't move back to the farm because the farm had burned down shortly before we left, and there was stuff that happened. So anyway, we're back in Oregon. It is shortly after the Gulf War. I make some new friends at a urban elementary school and find more people playing D&D, and also pick up Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Other Strangeness, as many people of that age are wont to do.
With that beautiful old, was it Kevin Eastman cover back when the Turtles all had just the single red headband? Oh, yeah.
I know there was a lot there in between the gaming sections, but that's...
So you leave Jordan, you come back to the United States, and so it's somewhere in the mid-90s. You come back. I'm sorry?
The early 90s. I was 9 at the time.
Okay, so early 90s. You guys come back to the States, and then you're in an urban area now. You meet some new kids, and you start doing gaming. Did you ever have another time where you faltered, where you weren't gaming, or have you been doing it nonstop since your return from Jordan?
Pretty much nonstop since then. The biggest break I had is probably in the latter part of high school, say sophomore year to junior year. School got in the way, and honestly, discovering women also got in the way, a big part. And during that period of time, gaming and all associated geek culture was not cool and would not get you a date. Not that even eschewing these activities helped me in that regard much. So
I am not a ladies' man myself. I understand that, but I was fortunate enough that, to the Midwest, it's really, really magical in terms of gaming. I mean, growing up in the time that I did, it was not cool. It wasn't a hip thing to do, but fortunately it was prevalent enough. There were plenty of attractive women who participated in the hobby.
Kudos to you. And, that is awesome. There were more women in your gaming group. That didn't occur really till I found a new group my senior year in high school. And that's also when I discovered White Wolf Gaming.
This is an area where you and I are simpatico. You're speaking to a man who literally has an Alrune tattoo on his left arm. So I loved me some World of Darkness.
Okay, clearly that's that is a lifetime dedication to being a warrior of Gaia, if you will.
Yeah, indeed. I love the ability to run down my foe, my prey, my food, whatever, however you want to characterize it, to run it down and kill it with my own teeth. There's a magic there.
Well, segueing to that, my personal favorite of the classic World of Darkness games was always Mage. It was the game that didn't tell me my interests made me the villain of the world.
What tradition did you gravitate toward?
Oh, Son of Ether is the easiest answer to possibly give to that. As I am an engineer and scientist professionally, but the Hermetic Order was also appealing. The first character I ever played was a Cultist of Ecstasy. There was a lot of that I didn't care for. if I wanted to be an edgelord of the time, since it was the 90s, I think that was the thing you were supposed to do. Thanatos clearly had some appeal to it. I think the one tradition I felt no kinship towards whatsoever, or held no appeal, was the Dream Speakers. That really wasn't for me. But ultimately, my favorite made were the Void Engineers from the Technocracy, which says something that maybe I am the villain in the
Right? Well, it's interesting because in my experience, mage is the intellectual, right? So a lot of the people that I knew, we sort of gravitated to different games based on interest. My intellectual friends generally gravitated toward mage. They liked the blending of the different disciplines. They liked thinking outside the box to avoid paradox. A lot of my theater and band friends were very, very much into vampire, but there were a few of us who were just kind of rabble-rousers that fell into werewolf pretty passionately.
Entirely fair. I always found werewolf to be the most political of the World of Darkness games.
Let's dig into that. Why do you say that?
So in Masquerade, it all too often turned into superheroes by night, where the conflict of humanity and clutching to it was almost entirely outweighed by cool powers. Once the pads came out, I was like, oh, well, I can just abandon my humanity entirely because that's kind of lame. I want to say the themes it wanted to deal with were too mature for the audience that wanted to play it at the time. That's not a universal truth by any stance, but I can't really say it isn't a commonality shared by lots of people. Whereas werewolves, you have this very strong social structure of people who, these killers, who all have to deal with each other and deal with the politics and ramification and the social structure of your renown is important to your advancement in getting your cool new powers. And so you have to engage with that portion of the game and life in the sept to become the rank 5 Arun, Stargazer, Lupus, badass everyone would want it to be. Because you got to start with 5 in all those.
Do you have an eidetic memory, or are you just very fortunate in your ability to recall information?
It is the latter. I do not have an eidetic memory, but I might when it comes to the mistakes I've made that replay each night in the quiet moments before I sleep.
Oh my God. That was a blow to the breadbasket. I'm stunned. I'm not sure where to take the conversation now. Your ability to recall that level of information about werewolf is impressive. I imagine that if I asked you questions about mage, you would be able to expound further.
Sure. Yeah. Blessing or a curse. I have an excellent memory. Moving forward professionally, it's one of the things that helps doing development and editing is you can recall all the things that have come before that and make sure it all aligns and meets the standards. So you can say, okay, these things are inconsistent without having to take notes about it. Because as we all know, consistency in gaming is both very important and very difficult because there's so many concepts being layered upon each other to make sure it's all coherent and consistent is a big deal.
Let me ask a question. Again, I know I'm all over the place. What is the difference between being a developer versus an editor or designer? Because when you say developer, because I am ignorant on what the role means in the gaming industry, I think like a producer in the film industry.
I don't think you're wrong. And this is going to be my personal definitions for how I do this. So a designer is essentially creating the engine. They're the mechanic of they're putting together all the moving parts that fit together. Your developer is going to be the person who's overseeing the work, making sure it's part of a coherent whole, kind of fitting it together and say, here's the things we need more of. They can very well be the designer and the writer. The distinctions between these can be fluid and frequently in gaming world is. And then the editor is the person who's coming in behind the developer and may also be developer, but is There's copy editing, which is just making sure your grammar, your punctuation is correct. Then there's your kind of development editing, which is making sure your content is consistent and coherent. This is poorly explained. These sentences don't make sense. And that might fall into copy editing as well. Some of my things are you've used this word too many times in a row, and that's making, when it stands out, you need to change that up so that someone else won't pick up that with the reading and it will take them out of the content they're reading. Starting a sentence with the same word, 2 sentences in a row, or starting paragraphs with the same word. You have to vary your sentence length, use short sentences and long sentences and medium, so that someone doesn't get lulled into just, all of a sudden 3 paragraphs later and they don't know what they've read. You have to keep them engaged. So to me, that's a lot of what editing is kind of the boring detail work of getting it done. And that may not be consistent with what other people do editing at. I might have more editing credits than anything else, which is just because I have friends that I will work with and do that for them. And I always offer to the people I want to edit for, I don't charge. Pete is a weirdo and demanded that I sign a contract, whatever. But
it makes sense because it is an important and I think oft overlooked aspect inside the hobby, particularly as someone who's read a lot of role-playing game books and board game rule books and miniature game rule books that could have used better editing. I think that talent or skill is one that definitely deserves to be compensated.
Sure, I guess, but I'm doing it for my friends, and I'm doing it because I love them and I want their work to be the best it can, rather than any desire for financial compensation, which I know sets a bad precedent within the industry for people who do want to get paid for it. But it's not like I'm out there advertising the service for everyone. I will only do this because of how intense of a process it is for me, for people who I care for a great deal.
What aspect of your involvement in the industry do you enjoy the most? Do you enjoy designing, developing, writing? What is the thing that, if you had to distill it down to that one aspect, which is the one that you would dedicate yourself to if you had to pick?
It would probably be design. Almost certainly what I'm best known for professionally is as a designer. I don't know if it's what I'm best at, or even what I spend most of my time doing. I probably spend right now in this, general sense of where I'm at. I probably spend more time developing and editing than designing. Once I get a couple projects off my plate, I'll go back to doing more design work for my next project that has been a few years in the works, actually. But designing is ultimately my true love, in the sense that it's communicating through the mechanics of a game what the game is about to people, and getting those all to link together so that it kind of teaches you what the game's about and how to play it, and how all these, individual gears fit together to create this engine.
Can you give me an example of what you mean by a mechanic helping to define the vibe, the theme, the tone of the game?
Okay, so there's 2 key examples for that. For me, one of them is Earth Dawn. I don't know how familiar you are with that. It came out in 1993.
If we can just hit the brakes, Earth Dawn may be one of the greatest campaign settings I've ever played in. There was a time where I wanted nothing more than Earth Dawn Savage Worlds, and I realized that that's anathema because you can't play Earth Dawn without the Earth Dawn mechanics. But I loved that game.
I've got good news and bad news. Bad news is Earth Dawn Savage Worlds exists.
Of course it does. Listen, I'm nothing if not unoriginal.
The good news is Earth Dawn 4th Edition also exists, and I am the lead designer on it. In many ways, the way Earth Dawn's mechanics fit together, so you have your spell matrices and how spells work, and that tells you about the magic of the setting, how casting more powerful spells takes more time, and it creates the kind of, you have unlimited access to magic, but there's a cost to it. And you can only have so many spells, even if you can cast an infinite number of times per day. There's only so many you can cast safely at one time. So the choice is, what spells do I bring with me in general, as opposed to having everything available, which is similar to but different than what spells do I memorize throughout the day. And it gives spellcasters a great deal of power during downtime, but significantly curtails them during combat for the options they have, even if they can still participate regularly because there's no spells per day or mana points. And the matrix piece also go with the setting aspect of astral space being corrupted, and so needing to purify that through the pattern of spell matrix to protect yourself from damage is one example. And Hannah Academy, which is the game that I alluded to as being a Fate project I was working on before Earthdawn came along and stole me away, if you will. And it addresses some of my complaints with the Fate system, which is the distinction between skills and, I can't remember what they're called because I called them something else for so long, but essentially your stunts. There we go. And what a stunt does isn't very clear within the context of the setting and how, or the system, how they work. And the skill tree, there's a few different implementations on it, whether it can exist as a pyramid or exist as these two pillars, essentially. Anyway, within that game, the context is you are high school students in a magical high school, and your friendships are very important. So what you have are relationships with people, and the nature of your relationship determines, you get to choose what skill that's based on. So if you go lift weights with this person, it could be in athletics, could be the things that you do with them, or if they're your rival, maybe it's academics because you're academic rivals. It's kind of, you get to pick how this reflects your friendship and how it is, and it gets a rating, and that's your rating skill. The other person also gets a bonus against you equal to that rating, because that's how important that relationship is. Even if they're a rival, if it's a high rating, that means that rivalry is important to you as a character, and they get a big bonus. So if you have a bully, they're going to get a bonus against you, which makes them a more effective bully against you. In it, I implemented an experience system where everyone gets XP when someone earns XP because they're your friends and you all kind of exist together, which gets you invested in each other's relationships. And the relationships aspect, you have your aspects and you want to engage in them and resolve them to ask the question, is this aspect important to me? Does it define who I am? Because you're a young person trying to figure out who you are. So by working at the aspects and engaging with them, once you get it compelled and you accept the compel 3 times, you resolve that aspect. And you can just say, is this relationship worth it in this nature? Is it kind of a garbage relationship? Because you've let it affect you, and you can either cut the person loose, or you can say, no, this is important to me, and keep working at it. You can change the relationship at that point with them. They can be good or bad relationships. Like one of the aspects of the con characters that I would run was Dallas, and they had the aspect, a foundation of lies is still a foundation for one of the relationships. And that all kind of, like when you get an aspect compelled, you have to bring someone along with you. It can't just be you alone, and both of you get fate points, so everyone involved gets benefit. Because as we all know, when you get an aspect compelled in fate, it's going to affect technically everyone, not just you. And this way, it also means you have to be bringing people along with your trouble, because it's high school and you're never really doing anything alone. So you always have this group of people with you. And there's other stuff that goes on with the defining who you are and why you want to build up, figure out who you are, because that's how your magical powers work. So hopefully that makes sense as an example of how these pieces can all work together to tell the story of you and your friends and how you're important to each other, even if you are in conflict with each other.
Why did you choose fate as your mechanics? There are so many other, and the first thing that comes to mind is powered by the apocalypse. So you being a designer, I'm interested, what was your thought process behind that system?
So fate is relatively simple. I wanted to showcase some different ways it could exist in the game itself, as a game. And how it can be used to address some of my personal and other people's issues with how Fate plays out and how the parts work together. Fate Core itself feels like there's these different pieces that work disparately from each other rather than reinforcing each other.
Forgive me for interrupting, but Fate Core is one of the worst designed role-playing game books that I own. It's very, very cumbersome.
Yeah. I think there's something brilliant there, but I don't necessarily think they understood what they had. And that can be an accusation leveled at a lot of different games. That you've got a really cool thing, but I don't think you did all you could have done with it because maybe you didn't understand it yet. That's fair. And the way Fate Core is laid out, it's not telling you enough on how to use it. It's expecting you to already know and imagine all these things. And the examples aren't useful. I mean, they're the barest bone possible examples. And when they say, oh, you can build a magic system, and here's some different ways to build a magic system, you're left with, okay, cool, but those are all very different. And some of these sound kind of awful, and I don't know what I want out of this. Help me more, please. This is a big, thick book that doesn't do a lot for you.
Your assessment is much more concise than mine. It's a big, thick book that doesn't provide a whole lot.
Yeah. So why didn't I use Powered by the Apocalypse? Because I'm done with Powered by the Apocalypse.
Because you're what?
I think I'm done with it.
Oh, okay.
Apocalypse World itself was hit the scene, and it took a little while actually to gain audience. It was pretty quiet when it first came out. And I read it, and I went, okay, I think the best thing it did in terms of gaming as a whole is, and this is me personally, there's people who disagree, and that's fine, is how it teaches you a different way to GM. And it gives you a different way of looking at the game as a whole from the GM's perspective of presenting threats and how those threats interact with the players and things you can do with. If you limit your moves as the GM, then you start thinking in these terms of, here's the tools I have access to, and here's how I'll interact with my players based on what they do. And I think that was very cool. The playbooks themselves are neat for short-term games, but for a long-term game, it doesn't work for me. I like long-term games, even if they're not feasible in today's world. That's still just how I am as a person, is I like long-term planning, I like long-term character growth, I like thinking about how these characters grow as people, not just in terms of their abilities, which is why in Hannah Academy, I tied growth as a character to your growth of your abilities. You can't have one without the other. So there's the carrot for engaging in that system. Also, I personally hate roll under systems. I don't like them. And I was a big backer of Dungeon World, and I thought it was the coolest thing. And then I played it, and I went, this is the exact opposite of my platonic ideal for a D&D game. It does everything I don't want, and all the things I do want, it doesn't do it.
For those not in the know, what do you mean by roll under?
Roll under is where you're rolling your dice and you want your result to be under the difficulty you're going for. In Dungeon World, or I should say in Powered by the Apocalypse, this is staggered at your 7 is a partial success and your 10 is a full success. It's been quite a while since I've played them. So you want to roll under those results, which gives you kind of this finite series of results as opposed to rolling over. You can have an extended series of possible results because there's no limit to how good it can be. The best example I can think of for a roll under I didn't just immediately bounce off of and hate is Fading Sun's first and second edition, where you want to roll as high as you possibly can while still rolling under the number, which means as you get better at your various tasks, the possibility for having a better result increases because not only do you have more results that are good, but you have access to higher value succeeding results.
Most of your game design work has been with Earth Dawn 4th edition. Is that correct?
Correct.
Now, Earth Dawn is a game that I am familiar with, that I played I guess it was the first edition of the game, because it's still owned by FASA, correct?
A brief history of Earthdawn is FASA Corporation owned Earthdawn and still owns Earthdawn. FASA shut it down in 1999, 98. I can't remember. I remember I found out after my Chem 221 final, I went to the library and found out that Earthdawn was being shut down, which was a dark day for me. I was in college. So I want to say it was 1999 when they shut it down. Then it was licensed to Living Room Games, which produced some limited material for first edition, Path of Deception and Barsic at War, I believe. And then they started a second edition. So the thing that I sometimes forget as well, there's a couple books produced for first edition of games. But at the same time, Living Room Games had the license. Red Brick Limited also had a license, and they produced Classic Edition, which was these big, thick compilation tomes of most of the first edition material with some minor tweaks. And then Living Room Games went under, and then Red Brick produced third edition, and then very briefly produced third edition of Vise, which was only 2 books were released under that time. Then Red Brick was absorbed into FASA Games, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of FASA Corporation. It is also the primary owner, essentially, of FASA Games is L. Ross Babcock III, who is one of the original founders of FASA Corporation, along with Jordan Weissman. And FASA Games now produces Earthdawn 4th Edition, in addition to some other games. 4th Edition was formally released in, I want to say, 2015 after a Kickstarter in 2014.
That is something that I really appreciate about modern gaming, is the opportunity for a game that has a following the size of Earthdawn to still have an opportunity to produce material. And what I mean is that it's a cult following, for lack of a better term. I don't know if that is a disparaging way, if there's a way you would prefer that I phrase it.
No, I think that's an entirely fair way of looking at it. The following isn't huge, but it allows us to fund. I mean, right now we have a Kickstarter for a new book that, with 8 days to go, has 357 backers, just shy of $30,000, which isn't bad, but it also isn't a runaway success. It has a core of dedicated fans, many of whom have been following for the 20 plus years it's been.
That's impressive, though. I mean, because that's a small number of people, but still a significant amount of money. May I ask, on that book, what was your goal?
$5,000, but we knew we were going to blow past that number. As you know, in Kickstarters, there seems to be this psychological thing where you have a low goal that you're going to meet, but it'll still allow you to do the production, bare minimum production. But then you can add to your banner that you were funded in such a short amount of time, and that hypothetically can be used to build excitement, as opposed to games that have perhaps the goal they really want to meet, and they flounder to reach it because they don't reach it in the first day. And then people see that, and then they don't want to sign on for it because who cares? Or they go, okay, well, I'll see how it does in the last 2 days. And they see that it's not funding the last 2 days because everyone's playing wait and see, and it has funds. So the goal for many games, these very low goals are what they need to get the book out there, but they don't necessarily represent the realistic, what people actually think it will do and what they really want to achieve all things through it because of marketing psychology. Who knows how much is really real?
And again, not on this project specifically. I'm just painting a hypothetical. People are making a decision saying that, well, the absolute bare minimum we need to do the project is $5,000. However, based on our trends in our previous Kickstarters, we can probably expect to be somewhere between 25 and 30. And so when we're planning our logistics on the after the fact, we can probably plan based on that 25 to 30 and not the 5K.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that just the common way to go about it, that people lowball?
So I'm not going to bill myself as an expert. I mean, I've backed an embarrassing number of projects we don't discuss. Pete was shocked and appalled to find out how many it was. I was chagrined to have him look because I'm a backer. He can see this additional information about me that isn't typically available publicly. And
is that a number you're willing to share?
yes, I will share this number, but based on the projects I've backed, which is a lot, I believe that's a pretty common tactic for people who are more savvy about this. My Kickstarter number is 666 successful pledges, 8 active pledges, and 68 unsuccessful pledges on Kickstarter.
Wait, I'm sorry. That was the devil's...
That was the mark of the beast.
The mark of the beast is the number of successful... How many failed?
68.
Oh, that's not too bad.
No, I will back something in those last 2 days, even if it's failing.
What's your worst Kickstarter horror story on something that is not delivered?
Probably Quantum. So there's some that haven't delivered, but that may be because I moved 3,000 miles 3 years ago. And so I'm not necessarily going to blame them for that.
Okay, because you jumped across the country, right?
Yeah. And that may be a case of I get so many emails, I kind of stopped reading my Kickstarter updates, and that's embarrassing. And I shouldn't admit that, but
no, I can't. I mean, I can't keep up with my normal email, as you already know.
Yeah. I mean, I'm at 10,810 unread messages, and they're all Kickstarter updates.
My skin is crawling from anxiety at that number. The idea of 5 digits of unread emails, like my stomach is a pit right now. Ugh, and they're not even mine.
Yeah, I just got another one, so it's 11. And it's a Kickstarter update. So I'm not going to read.
I'm sorry. So you were saying that is you're not an expert, but it's a pretty common occurrence.
Yeah, I would say that is something I see a lot, where I see this number and I go, oh, that's a pretty low number for a non-PDF project. And then, they go through their various stretch goals, and that's all and well. And it wouldn't shock me if their first, say, 3 stretch goals are ones they always plan to include in the book, but you put them as a stretch goal so people feel like they're getting more and it's exciting. And, maybe if you only fund at that low level, those aren't things that you really could do, because your numbers all of a sudden are looking a lot worse if you're printing, because your volume all of a sudden has plummeted. And that means your per unit cost is a lot higher. And maybe the shipping costs are going to be higher per unit as well, because, the project is small. So putting it in the system, the upfront costs are going to be high. But I've seen so many projects where I look at your first 3 stretch goals and I go, oh, okay, those were things you clearly wanted to put in the book. And from being on the back end, here's peek behind the curtain, and I know I shouldn't say these things, but yeah, the first few stretch goals are things that were always planned to be in there. Like, here's stuff we just want to do anyway, but this gives an easy way to make fans happy with the project and build excitement about getting additional stuff, even though it was always intended to be in parts.
It makes perfect sense. And when you put your mind to the proverbial grindstone of thinking about it, well, duh, right? Like, I can't get mad at them for doing something that I'm like, well, yeah, that makes all the sense in the world. You go, you know what I mean?
It's never something that upset me, but there are some people out there, for better or worse, who, when they have the truth revealed to them, they get angry about that truth, that they feel they've been deceived for so long about these goals that they're like.
That's
unfortunate.
Oh, agreed. The thing that bothered me is not that, but I always felt like, do you do a lot of board gaming?
I own a lot of board games, but I don't play a lot of board games.
Okay, so you're a board game collector.
It's more complicated than that, but we'll say yes for it.
Okay, fair enough. Well, I don't know. I always complained about Fantasy Flight games, because there was a long time with the Fantasy Flight stuff where it
beautiful Ameritrash.
Right. It is Ameritrash. It's exactly the word I would use when I was a retailer. But I always felt like those games, like, I bought a Fantasy Flight game, and apropos of what we're talking about, expansion 1 was just the last 25% of the rules, right? Like I bought a game and it was 75% done, and then they screwed me for another $50 or $60 on an expansion to complete the game I already gave them $100 for.
Yes.
And that chapped my butt.
That's fair. And you'll see that a lot in board game Kickstarters, where there's like, in the Kickstarter itself, through the add-ons, there's an add-on or a tier that has a tier where you go, feels like this should be part of the core pledge, but it's not, because you can get an add-on for some additional money. And if people are already into this, they'll be like, oh, cool, it's a little more money, but that's fine because I get a little more game out. As a brief aside, the board game I have played more than any other board game I own by orders of magnitude. Well, non-hyperbolically, probably 2 orders of magnitude, is Mansions of Madness.
First or second edition?
First edition. Second edition, due to when it came out and the changes in my life at the time, moving and the way it plays, doesn't scratch the itch quite as much as the asymmetrical, semi-competitive, cooperative play of first edition, because I liked to be the keeper and conduct psychological warfare against the players, because at the end of the day, you're not playing the game, you're playing against the people through the medium of the game. As the keeper, you can make decisions and perform actions that don't necessarily move forward your position in the game, because as the keeper, you know what's going on. You know the plot, you know how it plays out, but you can conduct it as if you're a director, and you can engage with the players and get them to react in specific ways and go in specific places and deal with each other in specific ways that destroys their ability to successfully keep the game, because you understand them and how they're going to respond to these various things. And even if they know that you'll do that, you can plan for that and break them apart as you need to and send them in different directions and get them to focus on the wrong things based on how they're interpreting the decisions that you make for your position they can see.
What did you study academically?
I'm a chemical engineer.
Okay. Interesting. Your description of Mansions of Madness, you just walked through, what you said could apply to almost any game, right? That you're working the machine that is the human being and not the mechanics that's the game.
I have a half-hour seminar where I talk about how I GM. Discuss that.
Where do we find this half-hour seminar, Morgan?
On the FASA YouTube channel.
See, we haven't even scratched the surface of FASA and all the other amazing things that you do. So you have a 30-minute GM seminar on the FASA YouTube channel.
Yeah, and I believe it starts off with a quote from me is, GMing is the art of psychological warfare conducted against the players through the medium of the game.
That is a brilliant, brilliant line. So how long have you been game mastering?
I must say since I was 11, I was the predominant game master senior year in high school, so 98 and 99, when I encountered a group playing White Wolf. They had another game master, and there was kind of this brief 2-3 year period where I got to be a player again, and that was delightful. But over the years, I want to say I'm game master 80 to 90% of the time.
You are essentially a forever GM in your circle?
Yeah, that is my role, and that's fine.
Do you prefer game mastering to playing?
I like both. When I get the chance to be a player, I jump at it. So currently my issue is I don't have a group and I'm averse to online gaming. The interaction I need is to be able to see someone personally and how they have nonverbal responses, particularly as a GM, but in person as well, because verbal cues don't always have enough. And I've had bad experiences doing online gaming as a whole. So I just kind of avoid it. It's not for me.
You're preaching to the choir. Well, even in this interview, when we're discussing, trying to have a conversation over Zoom without the visual cues, like I keep stepping on you, and I don't mean to do that, but even communicating like this and just a conversation's tough. So I'm with you. I need human interaction when I'm doing tabletop.
To be fair to Mike right now, I don't have a web camera because I don't own one, so he doesn't get to see me, but I do get to see him. So just fair. I am the problem on this end.
It's no problem at all. Often the issue is me and lack of patience, but we were talking about you being essentially a forever GM, but your preference is that you like doing both. You said that you jump at the opportunity to be a PC. For me as a gamer, I have games that I prefer to be a player and games that I prefer to run the game. Do you find yourself in that camp?
Yeah. With Earthdawn, I'm pretty much always the GM, which is fine. I can't imagine I would be an easy player in an Earthdawn game.
Right?
That is not a position I would want to put anyone in, where your player can say, actually, you're wrong. And that's, personally uncomfortable. I know my counterpart, Josh Harrison, who was the line developer, still on the development team, he is a player in Earthdawn game, and kudos to him to be able to do that, because I don't know if I have the right personality to not correct some actually. But games I prefer to run versus play, man, that is a difficult question. Aside from Earthdawn, for its obvious reasons, if I love to run it, I usually love to play it. Oh, probably D&D 4th edition.
I'm sorry.
Do not.
There's people are sharpening their knives as we speak. You are.
Yeah, they can come after me.
You are pro 4E.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fantastic game. It is my platonic ideal of what D&D should be. As a fantasy adventuring game and the pioneer of the fantasy adventuring subgenre it created, to which there are many other entries into it. Other versions of D&D don't hit the exact sweet spot to me of what a fantasy adventuring game, which is distinct from just a fantasy game. And Earthdawn, for example, I would call a fantasy adventuring game, but one that aspires to be a little bit more than that. Whereas the purest, it is a distillation to me of D&D. So I like 4E. I don't like 5E. It bores me to tears. And 3E, it was a nice evolution, but I never want to play it ever again, and would play 5E over 3E every day of the week, even if 5E bores me.
I'm fascinated by the fact that you are advocating for 4E as someone who is a designer professionally, because 4th edition D&D did not resonate with me. But as a designer, I'm interested, what is it about 4E that you can that you say, this is a well-designed, this is a strong game?
The pieces, how they fit together. It's a complicated interaction. It went back to asymmetrical design between opposition and characters. They're not created the same way because they don't need to be created the same way. This is in contrast to 3rd edition, which is trying to use a symmetrical design where you can build a character and a monster and they're all the same. But it didn't work because you had to have so many different modifications and it became so complicated, cumbersome, and terrible. And if you wanted anything interesting, it was just horrible to engage with. And I know people who do it, and they do it very well, and they love to do it because of the complexity. But
I'm that guy.
Okay. And that's great. But
it's,
I have to solve differential equations at work, and I don't want to have to do that for my hobby as well, even if I can.
I'm a late bloomer, right? I'm a late bloomer in almost everything. And it wasn't until I played 13th Age that I really understood what they were trying to do with 5th edition. And then, of course, going back farther, 4th edition. So when you talk about the asymmetric design of character versus adversary, I didn't really understand that until like last weekend.
Oh, I mean, 3rd edition is a fantastic game. I see it as fourth edition in a different universe. Like in a different timeline, that was fourth edition.
Like, it's weird too, because I didn't care for 4E and I played it a lot. I've only played a handful of sessions of 13th Age and I'm enamored.
Cool. I mean, I like both. They scratch different itches. To me, 13th Age isn't a fantasy adventuring game in the same way.
Okay.
It's not about combat in the same way. It's not about delving and getting the fat loot. It's about your character and how you fit in with the icons and the setting, what makes you unique in your character's background. It's about these kind of big fantasy adventuring tropes, but it's not really a fantasy adventuring game in the same way. And I know I'm creating my own definitions for this, and that's fine. So everyone's going to have to bear with.
Anyone who understands, and this is probably going to be most people that listen to the show, because I don't know people who listen to the show that aren't gamers. And so mechanically, we may be a little bit in the weeds in some areas, but I think that people will be able to grok.
Okay, awesome. I'm glad they can drink.
You have an amazing mind. I wish that I could remember things with such vividness, with such clarity. But I also, as you alluded to earlier in the episode, I suspect that it is also a burden.
Yeah. So getting back to 4E, what I liked about it was that the mechanical complexity, but also the way the points of light, this vague implied setting, and how it wasn't afraid to go and do some crazy, super high fantasy stuff. The introduction of Feywild, and I want to call it Shadow Dark, but that's not the right term. So I'm forgetting something there. The changes to the Astral Sea, the elemental chaos to make these places gameable, to go there and have adventures in these like way over the top gaming set pieces, being able to distill down magical items. There was a lot in there that was just, man, this inspires me to tell these really cool, crazy stories that previous editions of D&D tried to be simultaneously high fantasy, but kind of stayed about it at the same time. Like the limitations placed on martial characters as they're defined in 4th edition versus spellcasters who got to do these high impressive things. I didn't like that dichotomy, and I liked the fact in 4th edition the emphasis was on everyone gets to do something cool, and we want people to be jealous of what the person next to them is doing, even as that person is jealous about what you're doing. While the implementation of skill challenges was rough because it was something new out there, I thought it changed the conversation. I mean, there was other games doing this similarly, but it changed the wider conversation because D&D is kind of always the biggest thing on the market.
It's interesting that you say that because it brings up to me a very salient point, which was the relative absence of commercial success for 4th edition relative to other editions of D&D. And while I can concede that it was a really, really well-designed game, particularly for those of us that are into toy soldiers, it was a great miniatures game. But why do you, and this is, again, I'm asking you to put on your designer, developer, professional hat, why do you think it was less successful commercially than other editions?
Too much, too soon. It changed the formula of D&D as players knew it and recognized it into something else. So the incremental changes from 2nd edition to 3rd edition were pretty small. I mean, there was big changes, but how people understood the game was small, and I think had it gone with similar small changes like we see in 5th edition. Because 5th edition, for as much as people love it, and they love a lot of things from 4th edition about it, even as they decried them in 4th edition, because 4th edition in total...
I'm sorry, I'm laughing because I'm guilty as shit.
Was too much all at once. It was too different, and rather than trying... I'm not criticizing people who tried it and didn't like it. It's the, they looked at it and they didn't want to like it. And when they tried it, they didn't like it. It's also something you have to run very much as written. You can't come in with preconceptions about how it should work, which is something I professionally deal with in Earthdawn when people read text and take their D&D interpretations with them rather than how it's actually stated as to work. that's something that has to be overcome and is a challenge. But going back to 4th edition D&D, those are a lot of the things I associate with. People would say, oh, this isn't D&D to me. This isn't my D&D. A lot of those I found were for people who didn't play it. They didn't play it in good faith, if you will. And I found when a lot of people did play it in good faith with a group who understood it, who wanted to like it, there was a lot to like about it. I'm not saying it should be universally liked. Not everything is for everyone, which is the truism of life, if you will. As well, people shouldn't castigate or identify something so strongly that they say, oh, if you don't like this, I don't like you, or if you like this, I don't like you. These are just things we do to have fun. People shouldn't get so upset about it. An edition war is the silliest thing I can possibly imagine over the lowest stakes you can imagine. Not since train war, model trains over what gauge rail is the best, has something mattered so little. I say this as someone who's deeply invested in the edition of Earthdawn, that there are a vocal group of people out there who do not like it. So
something that I don't do is deal with the criticism. Like, I just don't want to know, right? Like, I'm one of those people, I could never be famous because, or if I was, I would have to avoid any sort of social media or critiques for your ego and just your self-confidence. How do you deal with criticism from people like that 2nd edition Earthdawn's my game and I'm not even going to try 4th edition, or, I tried 4th edition and I don't like it for these reasons, and not constructive criticism, but like vitriol. How do you cope with that?
The good news is it's died down considerably since it initially released, and there was a lot of bad faith arguments as to why 4th edition was bad and how it was bad. They were based on people claiming to have played it and disliked it, while in their claims, they made patently false statements that didn't reflect anything about the game, but instead reflected, I could point to someone's interpretation of preview material that was incorrect, that this person had read and then said they played it, and here's what they didn't like. So as to how I react to it, well, initially it was much more poor, and now I'm more calm about those things because they can hurt. Constructive criticism, I attempt to take it as it's intended to be given, and that is, I will look at negative reviews because there can be information on how to do something better. And to be perfectly honest, it's not perfect, which was a bad sentence. Let's acknowledge that. So there are things I would absolutely go back and do different if I could, if there's a future edition I'm involved with. There's many changes to the system I would like to make, some changes to how the setting's presented, and some small, non-crucial, but I think important ways for inclusivity, because so as a subtopic, inclusivity is one of those hot button things around gaming. And for me, it's essentially, it costs you nothing and it makes someone feel better. What's the problem? That's just me. So there's no reason to not.
What kind of inclusivity changes does Earthdawn need?
Some terminology. So like cavalrymen, I would change that discipline to be named cavalier, for example, to remove that. I know that's a perfectly cromulent word, but a complicated one is the name giver obsidimen, which has a pun in there. So changing that to obsida person or obsida folk really isn't as good. So that's a complicated one, whereas some of these are easy to just find a word that removes that language to it. How some of the name givers are presented, changing the text to be gender neutral as opposed to, and that is true in later releases, it's all gender neutral as opposed to using he as the default pronoun. I know there's people who cringe when they see a singular they, but it's been around for hundreds of years and you'll get over it.
Has it really?
Yeah, that isn't new.
Is it? Okay. I literally, this is, again, it's just from a point of ignorance. I literally did not know that.
Yeah. Just like the origins of not ending a sentence with a preposition comes from one guy criticizing someone hundreds of years ago for ending a sentence with a preposition, and that's where that got started, when in fact it's not really improper English, because there can be implied words after that preposition. And you often have to go through these verbal gymnastics to not end a sentence with a preposition that makes the sentence very cumbersome.
That is one grammatical rule that I generally don't abide by because I'm lazy.
That's not laziness, it's readability.
Touche.
This is quite a digression from the original topic. I apologize.
No, it's quite all right. This is just what I do on the show, is we go all over the place. So in addition to being the lead designer for Earth Dawn, you are on the FASA board of directors. Yeah. You are the editor of the Chew role-playing game from Imagining Games that's going to be coming out next year. You are a consistent blogger at pandagamingrove.blogspot.com. You're Earth Dawn Panda on Twitter. In addition to that, you have a Kickstarter that when this episode airs, it'll be Tuesday the 16th, and there'll be a couple more days left on your Kickstarter when I drop this episode. What is your current Kickstarter?
It shouldn't surprise anyone. It's Vascothia for Earth Dawn. For those familiar with the line, it builds on the Theran province of Vascothia, which roughly aligns with Germany in the real world. For those who immediately remember the issues with the Theran Empire book, the German themes have been dialed back so that it's not just a one-to-one alignment of the Roman occupation of Germania to build up their own identity, the province's own identity and weirdness. That project is written by Nick Lowe. The lead developer is Kyle Pritchard, and I act as Kyle's development partner, the first line editor, and the designer for it in conjunction with him. Nick's a great writer, and Kyle is fantastic to work with. This is, I think, our second major project together. And I think it came together really well as a expansion to the setting in a weird location unto itself, very different than Barsave and its issues that it's undergoing, and relooking at the Theran Empire and what is happening there. For those who are into Earth Dawn, either past or present, maybe thinking about getting back into it.
There are a number of Earth Dawn titles on DriveThruRPG. So obviously people can get PDFs from there. Do you also do print on demand? Or if I want physical copies, should I go to the FASA website?
You'll have to go to the FASA website for physical copies. We don't do POD. We do offset prints for all of our books.
What does that mean?
Offset prints? That's a traditional printing that you would do back in the day, where you have signatures of pages. All of ours are Smythe bound, so you get you print one massive page, then you fold it up, trim it, cut it so it cuts individual pages, and then they're stitched together with cloth or with thread. So you get a signature of 32 pages. That's POD is more like inkjet printing in a different way. So this is the way you've had books produced prior to POD. Everything was offset. I would liken offset printing to old school CD production with the metal platters versus the CDR production with lasers.
Okay.
That might have been a technical information that only I understood.
No. I think that things like that are fascinating. Like, for example, I could watch hours of how it's made, right? So just the idea of you describing how the printing is done and the stitching and the 32-page packets, like I'm visualizing the factory in my mind. So I dig that sort of shit. Any which way. If people want to back that Kickstarter last minute, if I search Earth Dawn on Kickstarter, will it pop up?
It should. So I would suggest typing Earth Dawn Kickstarter, and that will get you there.
All right, perfect. But if I log into my Kickstarter account, I'm assuming I can just search Earth Dawn and it'll pop up?
Yeah, if you do Earth Dawn Kickstarter, it's the third item.
Okay, gotcha. How long have you been working with FASA on Earth Dawn?
I want to say I got brought on in 2013. before fourth edition was announced by Josh Harrison, who was the line developer at the time, based on the work I had done blogging about Earth Dawn, wholly unaffiliated with FASA.
So wait, someone from FASA discovered your blog?
Yeah.
And then you got a job?
Yeah.
So dreams can come true?
It's true, yeah. I didn't go out and apply or talk to anyone. I was just doing my thing.
Yeah, so you would just go out there and proselytize.
Yeah.
So does FASA, do you do freelance submission, or is there a submission process?
Absolutely. It's mostly about contacting someone. We take pitches. Sometimes it'll just be, we need various sections written for a project. So a project I did, and it was 2019, I needed various in-character, in-setting pieces written for a book. And so I hired out a bunch of people to do that work, of which Pete was one of them. And that's where we both discovered Pete is excellent at writing action scenes.
Is he?
Oh, fantastic. He needs an editor to like cut it down. But once they're trimmed down to be, not just for an action scene, there's a temptation to describe every little detail, to get people in the, like visualizing it correctly. But when writing, you should avoid that because it's going to take them out of the action itself. You can imply things, use ways to describe things so that it keeps it punchy. It keeps the action happening and gives them the general idea of what's going on. Because they don't need for it to look exactly how it looks in your head. They can fill in those blanks and have it look what's going to be awesome in their head.
Right. I mean, one would argue that's the magic of books, right? Is that you and I can read the same book and have similar yet divergent experiences.
Yeah. And if I were a lesser person, I'd say, and yours would be wrong.
But Morgan Weeks is not a lesser person. He may have.
I try not to be.
You may have a name like someone who is Dr. Morgan Weeks, PhD, MD from Miskatonic University.
I suppose so. I live in the right area for that, right?
You do. Now, I guess the last topic that I want to tread, you kind of crapped on that part of the country.
New England?
Yeah.
Yeah, New England kind of sucks.
How come?
It's mostly Massachusetts sucks.
Oh, really? Why is that? Oh, is it because of Arkham?
Arkham? No. I would... I mean, besides the fact that H.P. Lovecraft is a racist monster.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
That's just accepted. It is easy to see why the mythos and Stephen King both came out of here, and those are generously, along with Robert Frost, some of the best things to come out of New England. There's a reason they're known as massholes.
What is a masshole?
So it's a portmanteau of Massachusetts and asshole.
Wow. Okay. Well, you know what? On that, I think that's gold, Morgan. I think that's where we're going to wrap is with masshole. I hope that I don't find myself, falling into a gaping masshole.
You shouldn't. What I will say is New England loves dogs more so than any place I've ever been.
Really? Well, then it can't be all bad.
No, that's not. I make sure to say that so that when I say the other bad things, it's tempered by the fact, but they do love dogs, and that's important. I've been to nearly every state and to numerous countries, and I've never encountered a place that loves dogs and is largely responsible dog owners as Massachusetts, or I should say New England as a whole. There are parts of Maine that are quite nice, and I like Vermont a lot, but nobody lives in Vermont. That might be part of the appeal because I'm a misanthrope at heart.
Why doesn't anybody live in Vermont?
I don't know. Well, it's the second least populous state.
Why don't you live in Vermont?
Because I work in Massachusetts.
Touche.
And that's a hell of a commute.
I was going to say, I don't know the distance, but I could pull up a map on the Googles. So what is it about New England that you don't like? Is it the people? Is it the weather? Is it the food?
Man, you just hit the top three. You're missing traffic but we can file that under the people.
Okay, so basically, it's got too many people, shitty traffic, too many crappy people.
Yeah.
And shitty traffic.
Not everyone here is terrible, and when you meet them outside of their car, many can be genuinely pleasant and delightful. But if you're kind of anonymous to them in the grocery store, just dickbags. Everyone's entitled. Everyone's in a hurry. They need to go first because they're more important. I've had someone say, "Do you know what kind of car I drive?"
Stop it! They did not.
Yeah, and I told them I couldn't bring myself to care less.
Kick ass. Good for you.
There's a lot of shitty attitude. And put them behind the wheel, they're even worse. I know it's not an unsafe place necessarily to drive, but that's just because there's so many people here who drive defensively. I am a much more aware driver than I've ever been in my life, because every day I'm taking my life in my hands to interact with this vehicular death cult.
Okay, so that's a role-playing game that I want, right? Is I want Masshole, Vehicular Death Cult. It's going to be the Savage Worlds campaign setting I write for the Gaslands miniatures game. So I'm going to have some desolate Massachusetts wasteland like Mad Max, and it's the Vehicular Death Cult. That's amazing. That should be a punk band.
You know what? That's entirely wrong. That's, they'd have to have an album titled I-95 and a follow-up titled I-94 or I-495, because those interstates are.
Have you ever been in the room with Ken Hite?
I have met Ken Hite numerous times. He doesn't know who I am, but that's fine.
I feel like that if I was in a room with the two of you, that your rival intellects would create such a frequency that my head would just explode.
I do not think I compare to Ken Hite in that fashion, but I do appreciate the compliment in you saying so.
Well, your command of language is absolutely fantastic. And I did not realize that the last hour plus time has just spun by. But Morgan, I want to say seriously, thank you so much for putting up with me and being on the show. I could ask you a million questions about Earth Dawn in particular, but this passion project, the audience will only indulge me so far.
Well, it has, without hyperbole, been a lovely, fantastic time and delightful talking with you. There's nothing for you to apologize whatsoever.
Great. Well, Morgan, thank you so much. Why We Game is a production of the Influence Foundation. All rights reserved. Audio editing by Brodor and music by 99 Instrumental.